Okay, let's have a look at the design of our checklists and the actual checklist functionality. So that's made up of two collections of documents, checklists and checklist items. So these are the items that are under a checklist. And just be aware, checklist items is a sub-collection of each checklist document. I'll come back here in a second, have a look at why I've highlighted some of the properties there. But let's have a look at the flow that's been used for checklists. And this is why I separated the working on the checklists from all the supporting components, because the flow's looking complicated already, and it's probably going to get worse as I get into actually coding some of this. So just going through the flow here. So anyone who's an active user can design a checklist, and that's what it shows here with a design checklist. When they design a checklist, that checklist starts in under construction status, which basically means it's in design mode, but people can't start filling in the checklist results until we move on from under construction. So under construction is the first status for a new checklist, and then when the person who's the designer, who's initially will also be the assignee for that checklist, moves that checklist to being active to move it out of design mode. So when that happens, the checklist gets a status of being active, and two things happen. You can't design the checklist anymore, but you can. It is open up to start entering results under that checklist. So filling out the checklist items and saying which ones passed, which ones didn't. Carry on from that. We can see C fill in the checklist. So that's while it's in active mode. When the assignees are happy with that they've filled in the checklist and are ready to finish with it, then they go in and mark that checklist as done, and the checklist then gets a value of done. At that stage, and this may be an optional step, the team manager can look at checklists that are done and mark them as complete when they're happy that they're actually done. They should also have an option to change the checklist back to active if they're not happy that they're truly done. Also, while in here, we can see that the team manager also has the ability to update the assignees on the checklist. They can also do things like I just said, where they can move a checklist back from being done to being active. Once the team manager has marked the checklist as complete, then it is available for reporting, and that's going to be almost another subsystem for reporting, where you can report on just a single checklist or report across checklists or across activities assigned or associated with checklist items, all sorts of reporting options. So I'm going to leave that to a separate module later on, but just be aware that I expect reporting to be mostly on completed checklists. Now have a look at this blue line here. So the other thing I want to be able to do is have the idea of having templates, so having a standard checklist. So if you use a checklist over and over again, say for in software development, it could be for creating a new project, there may be a checklist for that. You want it based on the same set of checklist items and the same associated resources and categorizations and things. So you can do that by creating a template for that particular checklist, and then that checklist can be reused later on for other checklists. So basically, once a checklist is in any of these statuses, so this is indicated by a line from this grey box around all the checklist statuses, then someone who's a template manager, again it's a role on the user's record, can generate a template from an existing checklist. So this will create a new checklist. It'll mark it as a template. It's also going to clear out any details such as comments or results that have been filled on the checklist. So it basically becomes an empty checklist again, or a cleared checklist, and that's called a checklist template. And another option all people have access to is to generate a new checklist from a template. So it's just another way of getting to this active checklist, is to do it by generating from one of the templates that are out here. Anyone can do that. Again, by default, the assignee is the person who's generating from a template, and then they can use that template. They cannot, or they can use that checklist they've created. They cannot redesign that checklist. So if it's been generated from a template, by default, it's locked into the design of that template. However, they do have an option of returning this to design mode for a checklist, or any checklist, whether it's been created from a template or it's their own design. But when they do that, if they do it for one that's been created from a template, then it's going to lose association with that template, which is what's indicated here on this step. If it's a checklist that has got there by being generated from a template. So I think that's most of the main flow and who does what. Again, I can see this changing a lot as I get into actual development. And then just coming back here, the reason I've highlighted some of the properties on the checklist and the checklist item, these are properties that can only be changed by being in design mode, or that first checklist status of under construction. So you can't change categories or resources unless you're in design mode, because that's a design related information. It's not unique to each checklist. Same thing for checklist items. If you change these highlighted properties, then that's representative of a design change. Checklist items going to be a little different. So they're going to have activities that are associated with checklist items. So again, this is for metrics, so you can report across checklist item results for things that have the same activity. Another thing it has in here is this tag ID. So this gets assigned to be the same as the ID when a checklist is first created. But be aware, if you create something from a template, then that tag ID is the ID of the original item that the template was created from. So the result is, say, for a particular checklist item on a template, say gather requirements on a software development checklist item. So one of the items may be gather requirements. For all the checklists that have that item on it that's been generated from the same template, they'll all have the same tag ID. And again, this is useful for metrics, so you can look across and get metrics for a particular tag ID. And the thing is, again, the highlighting in yellow, if you go and change some of these properties on the checklist item that for one that's been generated from a template, then that tag ID really can't be verified as being meaning the same thing once the design's been changed. So the tag ID will be reset to that particular checklist item's ID. So will be not you'll not be able to do a metric that gets all the items for that tag ID if you've modified the design for that particular checklist item. That'll probably make more sense once I get into the actual development. I'm sure I'm going to be hitting that again. Okay, this is how I think I'm going to put the components together. Again, this may change as I actually develop the code. So at the top level, I think there's going to be a checklists component. So it's going to be the listing component, and it's going to have filters so I can list by the assignee and status. So basic level would be to get my checklists by status, but could be anyone's, a grouping of anyone's checklists by status. Team by status would probably be used by team managers. Then category by status, where the checklist is a template, so a way of finding templates that are in the system by category. And also have some links in there that takes you to the various views of the checklist, depending on what status they're on. So the next two components are to do with designing a checklist. So there'd be the checklist design and checklist item design. So the checklist design would be the top level component, or the parent component for designing checklists, and inside that it'd have a list of checklist item design components for designing each of the checklist items, and there'd be the relevant controls for doing things like add a new checklist item and deleting checklist items. The next one, and I'll put an asterisk next to these two, checklist and checklist item, and I was thinking of having two separate sets of these, one for pure views and then one for doing the updates of the values on the checklists. But for consistency, it's probably best just to have one and have them change the interface depending on whether they are in update mode or just pure view mode, and they'll allow the updates to stay in sync without having to keep two code bases for different components in sync. So top level will be the checklist component, and there'll be the parent component that contains a list of checklist item components. And again, whatever mode you go into these as will allow you to do things like update the checklist, say title, description, comments, and the checklist items, values, and any comments and evidence that you want to put with those, depending on whether they're in update mode or just display mode. There'll also be some options you pass to it to say what things you want to show. So sometimes you want a more complicated view in the checklist, see all the details, say for a printout or for archiving. Other times you just want to sort of see the simple view for checklists that you use all the time. You really just want to fill in the values. So make those options on those two. So these may be fairly complicated components by the time I'm finished. Another component will be this checklist status dialog. So this is intended to be a matte dialog component, and it's going to manage all the changing statuses of dialogues. So kind of the basic ones will be under construction to active, active to done, done to complete, and then the more complicated one will be active back to under construction, where it may have to flip some of the template specific properties back to clear them out. May even need some confirmation dialogues in there too. And the final two is the template to checklist component. So that's where you want to create a new checklist based on a template, and then the other way around, and this one would only be accessible by a template manager, would be checklist to template, so where you want to create a template out of a checklist. Okay, now on to coding. We'll see how this goes. I'll probably only put videos out if I see I'm doing something interesting in the code. If it's just straight Angular code, things I've shown before, then I'm not going to record them as a video. But I will, once I get the whole thing completed or at a good point where there's something worth seeing, I'll definitely show the user interface as it gets developed